I should say just thank you for having a conversation with us. Before we get into it, maybe it'd be nice if you could introduce yourself and how you got involved in the Solomon Islands.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Patrick. So my name is Joe Wood. I'm a conservation biologist. My background is actually in zoos. I worked as a zookeeper in the UK for several years. I then studied for a master's degree in conservation leadership at Cambridge University. And following that, I was employed as a consultant by BirdLife International to undertake an emergency rescue in the Solomon Islands for a species called the Santa Cruz ground dove. I'm sure we'll cover that story in more detail later. I'm now employed by Toledo Zoo in Ohio in the United States, and through them I manage a portfolio of in situ projects, mostly in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, mostly focused on columbiforms, so pigeons and doves. I'm also the co-chair of the newly formed IUCN SSC Pigeon and Dove Specialist Group.
There's a very interesting set of ground pigeons in the Solomon Islands. One that when we initially started working on conservation projects, we were focused on CHOISEUL. And you know that the CHOISEUL ground pigeon, the extinct bird on CHOISEUL, occurred there on CHOISEUL, and some say maybe on Ramos Island, but we're not sure about that. I actually saw that bird in the American Museum of Natural History. It's very sad holding that bird, extinct bird that was once abundant, because they collected a bunch of that species on northwest CHOISEUL. Can you tell us a bit about the Santa Cruz ground dove? Where is that bird found today?
Yeah, interesting that you bring up the CHOISEUL pigeon. That's quite a nice island. Pigeons and doves, which collectively are called columbiforms, they show really high levels of endemism across islands. They have a real tendency to speciate and to evolve into unique forms when they become isolated on islands. And the CHOISEUL pigeon, nice example of that, really extraordinary pigeon. But as with most of these island pigeons, not at all prepared for the threats which it encountered when humans got to those islands initially, and then later the arrival of European explorers and the problems that they brought with them. Santa Cruz ground dove is a member of another genus of ground doves, which are fairly widespread. They're found throughout most of the Pacific, all different species. Again, high levels of endemism, although sadly several species are already extinct. So yes, this genus of ground doves are found all throughout the Pacific, all across various islands. Several are sadly already extinct, the thick-billed ground dove being one, a Tanner ground dove being another. And they're related to other ground doves which are found in Southeast Asia. They were originally grouped together with the bleeding heart doves in the Philippines. The Santa Cruz ground dove in particular was at one point fairly widespread. It was found all throughout the eastern Solomon Islands, and then much of Vanuatu was really badly when it encountered mammalian predators introduced with European explorers, particularly black rats and cats, devastated populations of these birds. And as a result, the species is locally extinct across most of that former range. There are unconfirmed reports that some still persist in the mountains on Santo in Vanuatu, but there's been no confirmed sightings there for quite some time. The last confirmed population is confined to Tinakula, which is a tiny island, tiny volcanic island down in Santa Cruz province in Tuamotu, Eastern Solomons, only 2 miles across and also an active volcano. No permanent human population on Tinakula, and as a result, that island has managed to remain rat-free. And so it's a real last haven for that particular species. Although even there, as we know, as we've learned over the last few years, it's not actually entirely immune from threats.
So would you say that the future of the Santa Cruz ground dove is in ex situ conservation?
I would certainly say that ex situ conservation is a huge part of our efforts to save the Santa Cruz ground dove now. Really interesting story, actually, with the Santa Cruz ground dove in particular. Not at all the norm for how ex situ programs are normally founded. The situation with the Santa Cruz ground dove was that it was already, as I've said, very rare and incredibly localized. And because of that rarity, there was interest from collectors in the Middle East who have a real passion for pigeons and doves and like to maintain large private collections of as many different species as they can. And some of these collectors were aware of the existence of the Santa Cruz ground dove and viewed that as a species which they might like to see in their collections. And through the wonders of social media, which really opened up communication links all around the world, they were able to locate people in the Solomon Islands who were prepared to supply them with those birds. And so some local trappers in 2016 and 2017 went to Tinakula and removed a large number of those birds for illegal export. We think upwards of 200, maybe 250 in total, removed from the island. And then move those birds to the premises of what commercial wildlife exporters in Honiara, with a view to then sending them on out to the Middle East. And at least one consignment was in fact sent to the Middle East. Some Santa Cruz ground doves we know are in private hands in Qatar. And then in 2017, Tinakula, which as I mentioned before is an active volcano, erupted and spilled hot ash and gas all over the island and burned much of the forest. And that led to like very real fears that was it for the Santa Cruz ground dove and that we'd missed our chance. Then it turned out that a fairly large consignment of these birds, which as I said had been sent to Honiara, were still in the country and were still being held at the premises of these wildlife exporters, which is totally illegal. These birds are covered by Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act. So any kind of trade or export in them is against the law. But there was very little capacity existing in the Solomon Islands to do anything about that, even though it was clearly an emergency and time was clearly of the essence. So I was hired at very short notice, 4 days notice, to fly to the Solomon Islands and try and assess the situation and get a handle on what was going on, and if at all possible, secure those birds, keep them safe until we had enough time to formulate a long-term strategy as to what we were going to do with them, which I did, working with the Solomon Islands Ministry of Environment, where we were able to confiscate those birds, to construct temporary aviaries and rehabilitate them. They were all in pretty poor shape by the time I got to them, and we're able to save 110. So a pretty sizable number. Although the majority of those were males, there'd been a real disparity in mortality during the time that they were held by the wildlife exporters. A great many females had died because they were the ones that were a bit smaller and a bit less tough. And so, yeah, that was the start of what has become the Santa Cruz ground dove project, which now has a thriving captive population, half of which is maintained in Honiara still, being looked after by a team of local staff, and half of which is kept at Jurong Bird Park in Singapore. The wild population on Tinakula did manage to recover to some degree following that volcanic eruption. There was a survey done immediately afterwards, which ascertained that at least some birds had survived. And there was another survey done in 2019, which found that the ecosystem had really bounced back quite a lot following the volcanic eruption. The damage wasn't anywhere near as bad as we feared. And that, the Santa Cruz ground doves were breeding. They were there in fairly large numbers, and they were probably again approaching capacity for the reduced area of habitat that was still there for them. But one very concerning finding from that survey was that feral pigs had been introduced to Tinakula. So some of the local villages on the larger islands there had moved some of their pigs across to Tinakula to fatten on coconuts. And they'd originally had them contained within some of the gullies there. But those pigs had managed to break out of that confinement and had overrun the island and were breeding out of control and were causing quite significant damage to the forest understory. So ground doves, as the name suggests, their ecological niche is that they forage on the ground. They spend their time searching through the leaf litter for invertebrates and feeding on fallen fruit. And so they're very dependent on that niche and very susceptible to anything which disturbs that, which pigs are very good at doing. As to what the situation on Tinakula is now, we don't know. Due to the disruption around COVID, it's not been possible to do a follow-up survey for the last 2 years. There's been no action implemented to do anything about the feral pig population, which we presume is still breeding unchecked. And so the threat of Santa Cruz ground doves becoming extinct in the wild remains very real. And for that reason, the captive population remains of vital importance.
Wow. So there's a few things that I gather from what you've just shared, and that is the trade in birds is quite a lucrative business. I got online and had a look at the CITES record of birds traded from the Solomon Islands and filtered in the numbers for the year 2000 till 2018. And this is public knowledge. It's available on the CITES website, but it shows very high numbers of, especially the endemic parrots, the cockatoo, the Solomon Islands, the Kopsi cockatoo out of the country. From 2004 alone, there was in one shipment more than 3,700 individuals sent overseas.
Wow.
And from 2000 to 2018, just the cockatoo, there was more than 25,000 individuals sent in that period, and probably more in the eclectus, in the eclectus parrots, of the eclectus parrots sent out. So it is trade that is quite lucrative, and not just in birds, but also in reptiles. Right now, we've just submitted a paper to, hopefully it gets published, on the local perceptions of Solomon Islanders on the abundance and the trend in population of the monkey-tailed skink, with the recommendation to cease all trade of the monkey-tailed skink from the wild and perhaps focus on a more managed captive breeding program for the skink. So with the issue with the Santa Cruz ground dove and the ex situ conservation work both in Jurong Bird Park in Singapore and in Honiara, this is kind of led to the Solomon Islands Recovery Center. Is that correct? The establishment of that new center. Can you share a little bit about the aims and the objectives of this center? It looks like it will be an important center for specific species conservation projects, especially on the endemic fauna of Solomon Islands. Can you just share a bit on that?
Sure. Yeah, I certainly can. But before I do that, just to return to the points that you were making just now, those figures are obviously shocking. The sheer volume of birds and reptiles that are being shipped out of the Solomon Islands. There's a couple of things worth mentioning there. One is the disparity between the prices that are being paid for those animals at various points in the supply chain. The local trappers in the Solomon Islands are paid a very small amount of money for bringing in those animals. The exporters make significantly more. And then the people trading in those species, by the time they get to the end market in Europe or Asia or the Middle East, are making very significant amounts of money. So that's really worth highlighting. It's not just that these species are being traded unsustainably, it's that the people who are trading in them really aren't realizing anything like the true value of the animals passing through their hands. The other thing which is really important to flag is that although those numbers are very big, that is almost certainly just a fraction of the animals that were removed from the wild in the first place. pre-export mortality is very, very high. Mortality during transport from the Solomon Islands to end markets is high again. And then mortality but before those animals get to the eventual end buyer is again pretty high. These animals are kept in very primitive conditions. There's not a great deal of knowledge amongst the exporters of how to keep these things. Diets are often quite inadequate. Cages are often cramped and crowded and full of disease. Mortality is very high. So the trade is not just unsustainable, it's actually far more unsustainable than it needs to be. And I think that's worth flagging. Moving on to the conservation breeding facility, which we're calling the Tateri Species Recovery Centre. That is actually a collaboration between a few different bodies, an important one being the Solomon Islands Ministry of Environment, MECDM. Another one being us, so my organisation, Toledo Zoo, who have funded that operation from the beginning, continue to be very heavily involved in that. And another one is the Guadalcanal Plains Palm Oil Company, which is a subsidiary of New Britain Palm Oil. We realised quite early on in the project that the Santa Cruz ground dove in the Solomon Islands was really just the tip of the iceberg. That yes, it was in real trouble, but it was one of several species that were right on the edge of extinction, and capacity in country to do something about that was quite limited, particularly because for a lot of these species, the situation was so dire that ex situ conservation, the holding of population in captivity as a strategy to buy time, was absolutely vital. At the beginning of the Santa Cruz ground dove project, the only way to do that was to send the animals overseas to a conservation breeding facility in Singapore. But we realized it wasn't practical or even desirable to do that for all of these species, and that we really needed to work to develop capacity in country. And we struggled with that for a few years. We were maintaining these birds at an adequate but really quite primitive holding facility in aviaries that were built quite hurriedly right at the beginning of the project. And they were sufficient for the purpose of rehabilitating the birds, but they really weren't of sufficient standards to keep them long term. And we needed to build a proper dedicated facility. The idea being that this population of Santa Cruz ground doves will have to maintain ex situ. And the strategy that we eventually hit on for achieving that was a collaboration with GPON, who have big holdings of land on Guadalcanal, and who are very anxious that they, as a palm oil company, behave in a way which is ethical and sustainable. And so they expressed an interest in becoming partners in this project and provided a site, which was a real limiting factor. We couldn't find a site on which to construct this facility. So GPOL were very enthusiastic about all of that and had a very go-ahead attitude to the whole thing. And within a very short space of time had provided us with a piece of land, a site on which to start construction. And so we completed that first phase of construction at the beginning going into the middle of last year, 2020. And then COVID really just threw a massive spanner in the works there. I had been leading the project up until that point, but I found myself stranded and unable to get back to the Solomons. The team of local staff, which I'd spent the last 3 years training, really stepped up to the mark there and have been looking after the population of Santa Cruz ground doves with incredible competence, really doing a great job, continuing to breed them, sending very comprehensive daily reports, and really doing a great job. But we didn't have a clear route to get the new facility up and running. And so the project has essentially been static for the best part of a year now. But we have just found a way out of that deadlock, and construction is about to restart on that facility. And we hope to have those birds transferred across within the next couple of months or so. So there is at least movement again. And as I say, I'm very glad that the project at least hasn't gone backwards, that we've been able to hold the line with that, and that, yeah, the local team have really proved their mettle throughout all of this.
Wow, that's good. So just one thing before we move to another issue that has just come up in Gizo. I've just noted important partnerships between government, conservation practitioners, in this case, Toledo Zoo, the local partnerships on the ground, and industry, GPOL, which is a palm oil company. And so I just want to make the point that in terms of moving forward and talking about conservation holistically in Solomon Islands, as conservation practitioners and people that engage with communities on the ground, we're not against development. The country needs development to move forward, to provide schools and healthcare. But it is important that we kind of think about what kind of development is taking place. And in this process of development, are we looking after our really special birds, our endemic species, and doing all we can to maintain viable populations, both in the wild or, in a worst case scenario, developing a partnership like you have done with the zoo and with GPOL. And so that's a very important point to make in the Solomon Islands context, that we want to make these important industry partnerships on the ground. There are other examples of conservation success with industry. For example, the Kolobangara Forest Plantations Limited in the Western Province, which has this 20,000 hectares of upland forest on the island of Kolobangara. And that goes towards the FSC, Forest Stewardship Council certificate, and allows them to sell their plantation timbers at a higher premium price. So these are the linkages that we need to be thinking about when we're trying to conserve species on the ground.